wind did not howl in the winter of 1864. It whispered, wand sound, like a mother's grief held just behind her teeth. It swept across the Kansas prairie, finding every crack in the cabin walls, every gap in the hearts of the people huddled inside. Worse, this is not a story of glory. It is not a story of outlaws or sheriffs or grand gunfights at noon. It is a story of dirt, of cold. Worse, a man named Silas Webb, who loved his son more than his own breath, until the winter forced him to measure that love against survival. Silas was a farmer, a good one when the land allowed it. Worse, the land in 1864 was a widow's promise. Bitter and broken, he had come west from Ohio 10 years prior with his wife, Ruth, and a 1-year-old boy named Clay. Clay. The name was Ruth's idea. She had held the squirming, red-faced infant in her arms, looked out at the endless brown earth they would soon call home, and said, "We will build something from the ground, so let him be named for what lasts, what be shaped." Silas had laughed in, a big booming laugh that filled the wagon. He was a tall man, with hands like tree roots, and a back that had never known the shame of bending. Worse, bled enough, in the promise that if you worked hard enough, bled enough, the earth would give back. For a few years it did. They built the cabin from cottonwood logs, chinking the gaps with mud, and their own stubborn hope grew corn. They had a milk cow, a bony thing named Bess, and a draft horse, a massive gray named Atlas, who pulled the plow through the stubborn sod like it was nothing. And Clay grew, quiet boy, with his mother's watchful eyes and his father's hands. By the age of 10, he could split rails. By 12, he could shoot a squirrel from a branch at 40 paces. He didn't speak much, but when he did, his words carried weight. Horse Silas would watch him walk across the field, and his chest would swell with a pride so fierce it felt like a sickness. "That boy," he'd say to Ruth, "will own this whole valley one day." Ruth would just nod, her hands busy with mending, her face already showing the lines of worry that constant poverty carves into a woman, because the truth was, they were always one bad season away from ruin. Well, and that season came. The summer of '64 was a furnace. The corn shriveled on the stalk, turning brown and brittle by July. The creek that ran along the east edge of their property slowed to a muddy trickle, then stopped altogether, where the well went dry in August. Silas dug it deeper, 6 feet, 10. His hands blistered, then bled, then calloused into hooves. He had nothing but dry clay and stone. By September best, the cow stopped giving milk. Her ribs showed through her hide like the bars of a cage. October. Silas had to make the first hard choice. He took Bess to the town of Willow Creek, 30 miles south, and traded her for a sack of flour, a slab of salt pork, and a handful of lead balls for his rifle. He walked home, 30 miles. He didn't tell Ruth that he'd seen other families on the road, wagons loaded with everything they owned, heading west or east or anywhere that wasn't here. Or he didn't tell her that the general store owner, a fat man named Cornelius, had offered him a price for Atlas the horse. Good draft horse, Cornelius had said, chewing on a cigar, could get you through the winter. Flour, or Silas had just stared at him, maybe even some coffee. Silas had just stared at him. Atlas was not a horse. Worse things got worse. Without him, they could not plant. Without planting, there was no spring. Without spring, there was nothing. He shook his head and walked home. The first snow came early, November. It wasn't a gentle dusting, but a white fury that lasted 3 days, piling against the cabin door, sealing them in. They had the flour, or they had the salt pork. They had a few potatoes stored in a root cellar that was not deep enough to keep them from freezing. Silas did the math in his head every night. The flour would last, if rationed to a biscuit a day each, until January. Pork was half gone. The potatoes were shriveled and sweet, turned into mush when boiled. Clay, now 14, watched his father. He saw the way Silas's jaw tightened when he doled out the food, portioned towards his plate, saying she wasn't hungry. One night in December, Clay spoke. "Pa," he said, his voice just breaking into a man's baritone. "The Wilkinsons. The Wilkinsons." Silas didn't look up for the fire. Silas didn't look up from the fire. "We ain't the Wilkinsons. We ain't got enough food," Clay said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. The fact as cold and hard as the ground outside. "Well managed," Silas said. "How?" Silas finally looked at his son. The firelight caught the sharp angles of Clay's face, the same determination that he saw in his own reflection. For a moment he felt a flash of anger. Then it faded, leaving only a deep, hollow dread. "I'll go hunting," Silas said. There's deer in the timber south of here. Where's? He went the next day. He was gone for 6 hours. He came back with a rabbit so thin, it was mostly fur and bone. The next week, the real cold hit, or it steals your breath. That freezes the snot in your nose before it can drip. The kind of cold that makes the cabin's walls contract, popping and groaning like a dying thing. Their firewood was running low, or Silas had spent the fall so focused on food, he'd neglected the wood pile. Now, he was forced to burn the rails from the fence around the cornfield, a field that held no corn. One morning, Clay didn't get out of bed. Ruth found him, shivering under the pile of worn-out quilts, his lips pale, his eyes too bright. "He's got a fever," she said, her voice low and even. But Silas saw her hands shaking, or knelt by the bed. He put his hand on the son's forehead. It was like touching a stove lid. "It's just a chill," Silas said. "He'll be up tomorrow." But Clay wasn't up the next day, or the day after. He stopped eating. Fever burned through him, leaving him weak, his body shaking with cold, even as sweat soaked his shirt. Ruth boiled water, or she made a tea from the last of the dried herbs she'd gathered in the summer, feverfew and yarrow. She spooned it into Clay's mouth, barely. On the 5th day of the fever, Ruth came to Silas, where he stood by the window, looking out at the endless white. "He needs medicine," she said, "quinine, or at least whiskey to break the fever. And he needs blankets, rots, and food, broth, something stronger than rabbit." Silas didn't turn around. "Where am I supposed to get that?" "Willow Creek. It's 30 miles. In this cold, it's a death walk." "Or he's dying, Silas." The words hung in the air like a blade. Silas turned. His face was gray. The skin pulled tight over his bones. He had been rationing his own food so severely that walking skeleton. He looked at Ruth. She stood in the middle of the room, her hands clenched at her sides. She was not crying. The Webb women, he thought, they don't cry, they just endure. Cornelius, Silas said, the name tasting like ash. "Orson, he has supplies. We have nothing left to trade." Silas's eyes drifted to the corner of the cabin, to the heavy harness hanging on a peg, and beyond it, he could see the outline of the lean-to. Where Atlas stood, Horse had been reduced to the same state as them. Then, his great gray coat dull, his ribs a sorrowful landscape. But he was alive. Horse was worth something, especially a draft horse in a country where the spring planting was a season away. The thought came to him, and he tried to push it away. He couldn't force back the cold. It seeped in, filling every crack. He looked at Clay, at his son's gaunt face, the way his chest rose, and fell in shallow, desperate rhythms. "What first light?" Silas said. The walk to Willow Creek in the dead of winter was a penance. Silas left before dawn, leading Atlas by a rope halter. The snow was crusted, sharp as broken glass, and it cut through his boots. Ford found his feet, but the cold found them anyway. Atlas followed, slow and obedient. The horse trusted him. Silas had raised him from a cold horse. He'd spent hours with him, talking to him, brushing his gray coat until it shone. Atlas had pulled the plow through the hardest soil, had carried Clay on his back when the boy was too small to walk the distance to the creek when it got worse. He was a partner, a witness to every triumph and every failure on that God-forsaken piece of land. The wind picked up as the sun rose, a pale, indifferent disk in the sky. Worth his head down, his mind a battlefield. "He's your son. There's no choice. The son is worth 10 horses. But without the horse, what will you do in the spring? You'll lose the land. You'll have nothing. You'll be a beggar on the road, and Clay will be a beggar's son. Clay will be dead if you don't get the medicine. Clay will be dead if you don't get the medicine. Or next winter, and the winter after that. You sell the horse for a sack of flour and some medicine, and then what? You'll be in the same place. Horse. A year from now, you'll have nothing left to sell but the dirt itself." The argument circled in his head, each one as sharp and cold as the other. Fort Bride. He reached Willow Creek by mid-afternoon. The town was a single muddy street lined with false front buildings, their windows dark. Fort-wise, the general store was at the far end, a squat building with a faded sign that read Cornelius Mercantile. He tied Atlas to a hitching post. The horse breath plumed in the cold air. He stood there, patient, his dark eyes watching Silas. "Wise." Silas went inside. The store was warm. A pot-bellied stove glowed red in the center, and the air smelled of coffee, tobacco, and leather. Cornelius was behind the counter, a ledger open in front of him. Horse's heavy man. with a thick neck and small, assessing eyes. He looked up, and a smile spread across his face. It was not a kind smile. "Silas Webb," he said, "you're a long way from home in this weather." Silas walked to the counter. Of course, his legs were numb. He couldn't feel his fingers. "I need supplies," he said. His voice was a croak. "I figured." Cornelius leaned back. "When have you got to trade?" Silas didn't answer. He just stood there, the silence growing between them. Cornelius's eyes flicked to the window, to the gray shape of the horse outside. "That your draft horse?" Silas nodded. Cornelius picked up a toothpick, stuck it in the corner of his mouth. "He's thin. Won't last the winter without good feed." "He's strong," Silas said. "He'll make it." "Maybe." Cornelius shit. "Right, but I'm not in the business of maybe. What do you need?" "Why 9 blankets, whiskey, flour, salt pork, coffee." Cornelius pulled a pencil from behind his ear and started writing on a scrap of paper. He added as he wrote, muttering to himself. Then he turned the paper around. Silas looked at the number. His stomach dropped. It was more than he'd imagined. Cornelius said, "I need the horse, and that harness in your hand, and a promise of first crop from your south field come spring." Silas stared at the paper, way, blurring. He thought of Clay, lying in the bed, his breath rattling. He thought of Ruth, her face a mask of stone. "The horse alone," Silas said, his voice barely a whisper, "for the medicine and the whiskey, and 1 blanket." Cornelius sucked on his toothpick. He made a show of thinking. Then he shook his head slowly. "The horse," he said, "for the medicine, the whiskey, half the flour, no blanket." Silas felt the world tilt. The blanket. Clay needed the blanket. Bull was the enemy as much as the fever. "He's my son," Silas said. He didn't mean to say it out loud. It just came out. Cornelius's expression didn't change. "The price is the price, Webb. Of course, you want to save your boy, you pay it. Or you walk back out into that snow and see if prayer works better." Silas's hands were shaking. He looked at the window again. Atlas stood there, patient, his head low, against the cold. He saw himself in the spring, standing in the empty field, no horse to pull a plow. He saw the land he had bled for, claimed by the bank, reclaimed by the prairie. He saw himself a failure, and he saw Clay's face, not the fevered, gaunt face of a sick boy, face of the man he would become, the man who would own the valley. He closed his eyes. "No," he said. The word came from a place he didn't know existed, a dark self-eye, place that he had kept hidden even from himself. Cornelius raised an eyebrow. "No, no blanket," Silas said, his voice cracking. "No, I need the horse." He turned and walked out of the store. Horses. He untied Atlas. His hands were so cold, he could barely manage the knot. He mounted the horse, his legs too weak to grip, and he turned back towards the cabin. The walk back was a blur of white and gray. Of course, he was halfway home when the truth of what he had done settled into his bones like the cold. He had chosen, or in that moment, in that warm, stinking store, he had made a choice. He had looked at the cost of his son's life, a horse, a harness, a blanket, and he had deemed it too high. He didn't ride home. He didn't have the strength. He let Atlas carry him, his body slumped over the horse's neck, tears freezing on his cheeks. He arrived at the cabin after dark. The door was closed. No light shone through the cracks. He pushed it open. The fire was out, or things got worse, as cold as the outside. In the corner, Ruth sat on the edge of the bed. She was holding Clay's hand. She didn't look up when Silas came in. Silas stood in the doorway. He couldn't move. He saw Clay's face, white as the snow, his lips a pale blue. The blankets were pulled up to his chin, but they were thin, useless. I couldn't," Silas whispered. Ruth turned. Her face was not stone anymore. It was something else, something broken. "He's gone, Silas," she said. The words didn't make sense. They were just sounds. Silas stepped forward. He fell to his knees beside the bed. He reached out and touched Clay's face, cold as the ground outside, cold as the bargain he had made in his own soul. He looked at his son's hands, those hands, the hands that could split rails, that could hold a rifle steady, that could cup a handful of river water and bring it to his father's lips on a hot day. He had held those hands when Clay was a baby, marveling at how small they were. Now he had let go. A sound came out of Silas. It was not a cry. It was not a scream. It was a groan, pulled from the very floor of his being. The sound of pure animal loss. Collapsed against the bed, his forehead pressed to Clay's still chest. He could feel nothing. No heartbeat. No breath. I could have traded. He choked. I could have traded. He asked for the horse. Horse and I said no. Ruth didn't answer. She just sat there, holding her son's hand, staring at the cold, dark hearth. They buried Clay the next day. Ground was frozen solid. Silas had to build a fire over the gravesite to soften the earth, then dig with a pickaxe, each swing a punishment. He dug for 6 hours. Ruth stood by, wrapped in a shawl, not offering to help, not speaking. When the hole was deep enough, they lowered Clay into it. They had no coffin. They wrapped him in the best blanket they had, the one Silas had refused to trade for. As Silas began to shovel the dirt back in, Ruth finally spoke. Before things got worse, she said, and now the earth has taken him back. She turned and walked to the cabin. Silas finished the burying alone. Spring came late that year, but it came. The snow melted. Creek began to run again. The prairie greened, soft and forgiving, as if it had never been a place of death. Silas planted the south field. He did it by hand, forced himself to the plow like an animal, and walked the furrows, the iron blade biting into the earth. He planted the corn, one seed at a time, his back breaking under a sun that did not care. Ruth left him that summer. She didn't make a scene. She just packed a small bag with her dress, her Bible, and a photograph of Clay taken when he was 3. She walked out the door and down the road towards Willow Creek. Silas stood in the field and watched her go. He wanted to call after her. He wanted to run and grab her, to beg her to stay. But his legs wouldn't move. His voice was gone. He had sold his son for a horse, and in doing so, he had lost everything else. He lived in the cabin for 30 more years. He never remarried. He never had another child. Horse, short ride. He farmed the land, and the land gave him just enough to survive, but never enough to prosper. Atlas died the following winter, old age and weakness. Silas found him lying in the lean-to one morning, his great gray body still, his eyes open. Silas buried him under the cottonwood tree by the creek. He didn't mark the grave. He grew old alone. The cabin fell into disrepair. The roof leaked. The chinking crumbled. By the time he was 70, he was living in 2 rooms, the rest of the house abandoned to the wind and the mice. People in Willow Creek knew him as the crazy old hermit on the Webb claim. Some remembered the story. A few whispered it when they thought he couldn't hear. Sold his son for a horse, let the boy die for an egg. Crazy old fool. Or he heard them. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He would sit on his porch in the evenings, looking at the grave under the cottonwood, and he would think about that moment in Cornelius's store, the warmth, the smell of coffee, or the small, assessing eyes of the merchant. He would think about the number on the paper, the price. He would think about his hands, the hands that had held his sons, the hands that had let him go. Of course. And he would wonder what kind of man puts a price on his own child's life. He never found an answer. Where he died in the spring of 1898. A neighbor found him sitting in his chair on the porch, his face turned towards the field where he had planted the corn by hand, year after year. In his hands, he held a small, faded photograph. On the back, in Ruth's handwriting, were the words, Clay Webb, age 3, our hope. The neighbor, a young man named Elias, looked at the photograph. He looked at the old man's face, and he saw something he had never seen before, not in all the years he had known Silas Webb. Peace? No, it was not peace or surrender. The final, exhausted surrender of a man who had fought a war against himself for 34 years and had lost. Elias buried him next to Clay. He didn't know what to say at the grave, of course. He just stood there for a long time, looking at the 2 mounds of earth, father and son, side by side. The wind whispered across the prairie, a soft, constant sound. Of course, the choices a man makes when he is cold, when he is hungry, when fear wraps itself around his heart like a fist. He thought about what he would have done, of course, and he was grateful that he would never have to know. The lesson, if there is one, is not simple. It is not about greed, though greed was there. It is not about love, though love was there too. Worse, it is about the moments when the soul is tested, when the fire burns away everything that is not essential, and you are left with the naked truth of who you are. Silas Webb was a man who loved his son, but in the end, he loved his land more. He loved his pride, of course. He loved the idea of what he had built. and he could not bear to see it crumble. And that love, that misplaced, desperate love, cost him everything. Worse than weight, that the only thing a man truly owns is the love he gives. The rest, the land, the horse, the cabin, is borrowed. It all returns to the dirt. But a son is not dirt. A son is hope. Worse, buried, does not rise again. So when the wind whispers across the prairie, remember Silas Webb, remember Clay, remember the price of a horse, white of your own heart. What would you have done? Because the winter comes for all of us, and the cold finds the cracks in every soul.